South Africa must prioritise economic and energy reform now instead of waiting to be pushed. That's according to Business Leadership South Africa CEO Busisiwe Mavuso. She foresees government needing further relief from the International Monetary Fund to help the limping economy. South Africa has requested over 70 billion rand from the global funding body to assist with COVID-19 relief. However, loans come with tough immediate conditions, often detrimental to borrowing states. This is what Mavuso says the governments should seek to avoid. She joins me now from Johannesburg via Skype for this conversation. Busisiwe, thanks a lot for joining us this afternoon. Interesting article that you've written there, but the one thing that comes clear of mind is the fact that this issue around, number one, South Africa's budget, number two, the need for National Treasury to actually go into international lending agencies was long time coming before COVID-19, simply because on the one hand, we've got a welfare bill that caters to just under 18 million people.
Absolutely. And I think, as you rightfully say, it looks like it's been a long time coming. But I think the disheartening thing about it is precisely because there is still something we can do as a country to try and avert, losing our economic sovereignty to the IMF. I mean, there are a lot of these reforms that we've been talking about, at least for the past 3 years. But for whatever reason, and let me say, because of government's indecisiveness and lack of agency and lack of realizing the severity of the situation, we might find ourselves actually going to the IMF because we are failing to do some of the things that we should have done. And I think the unfortunate thing is that as soon as the IMF walks in, their loans come with conditionality. And they are actually going to force us to do some of the things that we've been avoiding to do. And I think prime on those things are mainly going to be the fiscal consolidation, the monetary, restrictions, and they are going to definitely ensure that we do the SOE reforms that we've actually been failing to do as a country for the longest time. So I think it's actually worrying, that we might find ourselves in a position where we actually lose our sovereignty for reasons that are actually within our control, because we can still do something about it. But also when you look at where the country is and some of the decisions that we're taking, it shows that we are really very quickly on our path, towards going to the IMF. You would know that in terms of the numbers that have been released, quarter two GDP has declined by 30%. We have lost about 1.1 million jobs, at least in the formal sector. And I think if you include the informal sector, that situation is even more dire. Our tax revenues have, tax revenue lost, has been about 300 billion rands. We have decided last week Sunday, to suspend indefinitely the alcohol industry, which is responsible for 1 million jobs, responsible for 10% of our revenues, responsible for about 6 billion of our export revenue, and responsible for about 300,000 township-based businesses. Now, these decisions that we're making as well are not helping. And in the meantime, we have, government running around trying to find 10 billion rands for an SAA. So I think you see how, our lack of decisiveness or our lack to prioritize, what is important at the moment and what is not, is precisely what is actually going to land us right into the hands of the IMF, where we're actually going to be facing real austerity, as a country, which means the situation is going to be much more worse than where we find ourselves at the moment.
Busisiwe, the IMF is also known for saying that the conditionality actually belongs to that specific country. Would you say that that's a true sentiment?
It definitely is not true, and I think the conditionality that they impose is actually quite dire, and they actually impose a lot of these conditionalities. And I think it's about 30 on average, at least for the past, if you look at the last 26 countries that have actually granted loans to, at least between 2016 and 2017. And they might start actually in a situation where the conditionality is not that much, but as they review your numbers and they see that you are actually not implementing some of these things the way you're supposed to be implementing them, they just increase the conditionality. And some of the things that they are known to actually impose is, for instance, the cutting off the public sector wage bill. They are known to impose the hiking of the regressive tax, which is bad. And I think we know how the country was up in arms 2 years back when we hiked the VAT, because we were worried that it's actually going to have dire consequences on the poorest of the poor in this country. You know, they normally force government to cut back on essential services. And you have seen in other countries the health system and the schooling system deteriorating, you know, because the IMF has actually insisted that government, you know, cut back on those services. And actually they would impose things like some of the subsidies on staple foods are going to have to be removed. So that is where we are going to as a country if we are not careful. And as I'm saying, it's going to be unfortunate because we know what needs to be done. We've already identified it. You know, we know what are some of the decisions that we need to make as a country to be able to avert this. But unfortunately, it looks like we are actually going to walk right into the IMF trap with our eyes wide open if we are not careful.
Yeah, I mean, we're talking here about the need for decisive leadership, Busisiwe. On the one side, you're mentioning the issue of SAA, where it appears as though between Treasury as well as public enterprise, it's almost like hot potatoes is being played here with regards to the matter of SAA. Now it's around finding that 10 billion rand, as you would say. On the back of this, how do we start to practically address the issue of job losses? And one thing that has been said is the fact that government has failed time and time again to actually provide substantial support to businesses, because we know that businesses are the ones that hire the majority of people instead of public. Well, public sector does it now, but businesses are the majority of those that would hire individuals. So in that sense, is our issue here a lack of accountability from government perspective, or maybe the fear of making those very hard decisions for the betterment of the economy?
But, you know, it actually doesn't make sense, and it's actually counterintuitive, because you would think that primary on government's list of urgent things to do is to ensure that we can bring in the much required investment. You would remember that the president went into so far as, you know, employing investment envoys to try and get foreign direct investment into this country. But the reason why we failed dismally at attracting investment is precisely because the environment within which business operates in this country is not a conducive environment. And we know what needs to be done. We've been talking about the issues around the ease of doing business. We've been talking about releasing the spectrum. We've been talking about energy security. We've been talking about SOE reform. You know, the fact that government doesn't need all 743 SOEs, all of which are actually draining the fiscus. You know, government is not receiving even a single dividend from all of them. And yet there is this insistence. I don't know whether it is a function of some ideology by the ANC to own all of these things, which are all dysfunctional, but that is actually, you know, seriously affecting the country. We know issues around regulatory rigidity that have actually been raised over and over again. We know issues around, you know, the simplification of the mining investment regulation, you know, to allow the mining industry to can actually, you know, grow the economy in the way that it can, you know, and at the moment, we are also sitting with issues of corruption that we have just failed to address as a country. We know, for instance, that municipalities at the moment are actually on a serious looting spree of these COVID-19 relief funds that have actually been given. So it is these things that actually make it difficult for businesses to come into the country to invest, or for investors to actually come into the country and invest, so that we can get the economic growth. Because through economic growth, then you can get jobs. But I think government doesn't just seem to understand that unless and until you can actually implement some of these reforms, you are not going to get investment. And without investment, you don't get economic growth. And without economic growth, you can't get, you know, jobs. So it is precisely that failure, you know, and I don't know whether that lack of understanding, but you see, from where I'm sitting, I don't think it's a function of lack of understanding, because we know the National Treasury has been raising this issue. We had Tito Mboweni warning the country that in the next 3 years, we might be facing a sovereign debt crisis if something doesn't give soon. You know, these warnings have been given over and over again. We've been downgraded now by Moody's, the last credit rating agency that had us in investment grade on the 27th of March. And they've been giving us these warnings to say that you're going to have to implement these things. But because there's no political will and maybe no leadership in this ANC-led government, we are where we are as a country.
We'll see. We're going to have to leave it there for this afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us. A sobering discussion there with Busisiwe Mavuso, CEO of Business Leadership South Africa.